as a precondition for mental and social health. What does free mean? Freud discovered that if you brought people who were suffering into a clinical setting and you let them, and you prepared a space for them where they could say anything they felt like saying, that a psychological transformation would occur, that their thought would wander of its own accord, in some sense, precisely to those areas that were most deeply disturbing and unsettling to them. And that as a consequence of that wandering, they would attain a certain clarity and psychological stability that was not evident before that. Now, Freud has become quite the whipping boy in recent years, and I think that's the fate of geniuses whose revelations are so profound that 100 years we take them for granted as second nature and only see the errors that are left behind. Carl Rogers, who was arguably, he was one of the greatest clinical psychologists of the last half of the 20th century, said something that was an elaboration of the Freudian notion in some sense. Of course, and Rogers had been informed by what Freud had discovered and what other people had developed in the line of clinical treatment, psychiatric treatment. Rogers, who was raised as a Protestant and who wanted to be an evangelist when he was a teenager and went to university, but partly because of the scientific training that he had also obtained from his father, who had applied scientific management techniques to his farm, fell prey to the conflict between scientific and religious thinking and became agnostic, or at least atheistic, but maintained his central faith in the redeeming quality of the untrammeled word. He believed and put forth as an element of psychological doctrine that the primary goal of the therapist who was attempting to foster the mental health and, let's say, the cessation of the suffering, unnecessary suffering of his clients, was required, above all, to listen. Now, listening, that's a hard thing. And why? Because sometimes you hear things you don't want to hear. And you can't make light of that. And you can't say, well, you should just put up with it, because we don't know exactly how to put up with it, because sometimes you really hear things that you don't want to hear, and you're hurt because of it, and that hurt can be deep. And so it's hard to listen. And so Rogers said, you think you listen, but you don't. Here's a little experiment, he said. The next time that you're engaged in a dispute with someone, and so let's say this is someone in your family, and you're having a hard time reaching an accord, and so you're suffering the conflict that lack of peace necessarily produces, and they see things differently than you do, and they're trying to make a case for their perspective, which might involve the revelation of something that undermines one of your cherished beliefs, or even an accusation about your misbehavior. Will you listen? Well, why wouldn't you? Well, you don't want to be wrong. You don't want to be to blame. You want to convince yourself that what you already know is enough. You want to convince yourself that you're good in your current state, and you certainly don't want to allow yourself to be deeply disturbed by the revelation of an unpleasant truth that you cannot deny. And so you're motivated not to listen. And how might you not listen? Well, you can indicate your anger, you can indicate your displeasure, you can do that without using words, you can glare, you can roll your eyes. That's a good way to get divorced, by the way. I'm dead serious. The best predictor of divorce, if you're a couples counselor, is eye rolling. And that's disgust. And once the relationship is degenerated because of lack of communication, perhaps, malevolence, perhaps, ignorance, and there's nothing left but disgust, there's nothing left of the relationship. How do you know if you were listening? Well, Roger said, here's a way you can check yourself, and this is unbelievably useful. You can actually do this, and if you do it, it will change your life. If you do it seriously, if you make it a practice, right? If you make it part of you, it will change your life completely. When someone talks to you, you have to restate back what they said in terms they agree with. And that means you don't play any tricks, right? You can't twist their words. You can't defend yourself with all the little tricks you've learned to defend yourself, all the deceptive tricks that protect what you already know. You have to adopt their point of view. You have to do it with sincerity, and you have to reflect it back to them. And they have to agree. Now, Roger said, if you do that, most of the emotion will go out of the discussion. That's not necessarily true. But it's often true, because a lot of conflict is simply a matter of misunderstanding, sometimes just terminological misunderstanding. That's certainly true in philosophical discourse, but it's also very frequently true in ordinary discourse. And so you can at least be sure that if you can restate back to the person what they said, they know you were listening. Well, what does that mean, that they know that you were listening? It means that you acted out the proposition that they had something